Hello, I'm Liz Barclay, and this is the Exploring Enterprise podcast from the Enterprise Research Centre. Micro businesses, the untold story. I'm talking to Professor Mark Hart, who is the Deputy Director of Entrepreneurship and Enterprise Policy at Warwick Business School. Mark, you need to introduce yourself and you need to tell us what the ERC does and how you do it.
Happy to do that. We've been in existence for just over 13 years now, set up by government, and coming out of the financial crisis, there was a feeling that we needed to build the evidence base about small businesses, because small businesses, as we know, are really crucial to the economy. So the various departments and the banks, actually, Vince Cable forced them onto the naughty step to fund the Enterprise Research Centre, put some money in the game. And we were tasked with just tell us and make sure that we understand what's happening with regards to the small business population. We've known for decades they're crucial. But the Enterprise Research Centre then set about a research programme, really a research program not just on, navel gazing, but actually to inform policymakers, to inform the wider society about the importance of small businesses, whether it be internationalization, innovation, whether it simply be just creating jobs in the local neighbourhood. That's what the ERC has meant to do. So we have used a whole range of evidence from, government statistics or on surveys to really build a substantial evidence base now on everything you ever wanted to know about small and micro enterprises, but we're afraid to ask.
I'm not afraid to ask.
How important yes, Liz,
are how important are small businesses, and particularly micro businesses? Because if you think about it, small businesses are 99.6% of our business population in the UK.
And the statistics coming out of the department and the ONS every year point to that. It's not some sort of rhetoric that people who advocate the importance of small businesses and micro enterprises really cling on to. It's clear in the data. 60% of employment is in small businesses. So come on, we really got to understand exactly how important these businesses are.
Well, I was just going to come to the however. However, is our growth policy obsessed with the wrong businesses then?
I don't think it's the wrong businesses. I think that's probably too extreme, but I think that people take their eye off the evidence. People like to talk about the shiny new things that are coming along, and that is absolutely important. The future growth of any economy, including the UK, is dependent upon the harnessing of new emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, etc. We know that. But when I look, and this is what we in the Enterprise Research Centre have been doing, when we look at the evidence, yes, these sectors are important. Yes, those firms are important. The skills that they actually bring together and the contributions they make to society are really important. But if government is interested in moving GDP forward, moving job growth forward, moving productivity forward, we need to take an inclusive view of every private sector firm in the economy. And that's what I say the government has not been very good at doing. And it hasn't been very good at doing it for decades. I've been doing research on these types of firms since the 1980s. And, government has we love small firms, but when you look at it, they only like particular types of small firms.
They talk about scale-ups all the time. Is that what the particular type of small firm that you're referring to then that they talk about disproportionately?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, scale-ups, I just do not like the term. I like the verb scaling. A scale-up lends itself, well, how do you define a scale-up? And, I'm on record, as the Enterprise Research Centre has been for many years, saying that the definition that's in common usage by government, by other stakeholders, I won't mention them because they know who they are, talk about an OECD definition of a high growth firm, i.e. scale-up. This is spurious. It renders invisible the sort of growth that we see in the private sector. It has a definition which means that you have to have at least 10 employees. And our research shows that is, it's just wrong. And therefore, I like to talk about the scaling propensity of businesses irrespective of sector, irrespective of location, irrespective of size. I really am on a mission to try and get government to avoid setting minimum size thresholds for a lot of their admissibility to programs, initiatives, not just central government, regional government, the combined authorities, local authorities. They're all on this track. We've got to have more scale ups. But, my research has shown that it's not a cumulative total. 40% of scale ups disappear using that definition. So it's not a helpful definition, Liz, and I think we've got to get away from that, because what our evidence shows is scaling happens everywhere.
Are you then saying, and I know that your evidence shows, that tiny businesses can become major employers?
Absolutely.
Well, why is that not front page news then?
That's a very good question. I have been making this particular argument for many years. We've updated my whole. I like to follow the age of a business from the cradle to the grave, as I describe it. And it's about, well, what happens to a firm 1 year, 3 years, 10 years, 25 years after it's been going? So what I've put in place with colleagues in the Enterprise Research Centre, and in fact, it was a dear colleague, Michael Danes, who started this cohort analysis. In other words, we look at where they start, where they get to. So we have tracked cohorts of businesses. And one of the things that I went back and did in 2025 was look at that cohort of 1998 startups, about 250,000 of them. What happened to them up until 25 years later? And we find that about 16,500 of them are still trading. That's quite interesting. We know that most startups don't survive a very long time, but 16,500 of them did. And sorry to get into the detail of the weeds of the numbers here, but it is quite important. So, and every year we have 250,000, 350,000 startups. What do they contribute over time? Well, here's a group, 16,500, and of those, 1,000 of them started off as 1 to 4 employee businesses. And they're still trading a quarter of a century later, creating 100,000 jobs, on average 80. In terms of actual turnover, they're looking at about maybe 10 to 12 million turnover. So, are we saying that because they were 1 to 4 employees, they would have become they were scaling right in the first few years? If you look at the chart over the 25 years, it's in the first 5 years where all the scaling happens, but they would have been ignored. They would have been ignored by policy. And I think that's really wrong. So what I'm saying here is micro enterprises, ignore them at your peril. They are really important generator of growth and jobs. And I've done some analysis as well, which shows over a 10-year period, who creates the most jobs, micros or high growth firms as defined by OECD? And guess what? It's the micros. Go figure.
I think we need to talk to some of those micros and see how they did it. But are you saying that policymakers are too geared up for the flashy scale-ups, looking to back winners, want to back unicorns, and they're really missing the point here and not providing the right policy and the right support?
Well, I think there's two comments that I would make in response to that, Liz. The first one is, that how are they doing it? But when we started the Enterprise Research Centre, I asked the ONS could I actually interview some of these firms. And when we did that, we found out that, first of all, the sectors were quite amusing. And I brought a couple of them along to conference back in the day in 2014-15. Waste processing, waste management and fish processing. And everybody said, well, thanks, Mark, but that's not really typical of the high growth firm. And I said, careful, it actually is typical of the high growth firm. So that in that sense, they're in all sectors. So we talked to them. We said, well, how did you grow? It's organic growth. They're not using government funding. There weren't Innovate UK grants on the go. So a lot of it was bootstrapping themselves. And I think that's a really important message to say. There is ambition, there is motivation here in the private sector to be able to grow into established businesses. We do not need to say, what can government do for us all the time? I think that's really, really important. So these are businesses starting off 1, 2 employees and beginning to pull a story of growth together. There's not many of them, but those that do make it through to 5, 10, 15, and this latest tranche to 25 years are actually big players now. An 80 employee business in your locality people notice it. Hopefully they do anyway. Then you ask the question about policy. And I think it's really, you see, and I have a lot of sympathy here to ministers and officials because, they say, okay, we need to encourage more growth because we know in the UK that business dynamism, i.e. the proportion of firms that are effectively growing, has been declining for nearly 20 years. That the ONS says that, my own analysis says that. So that's the basic growth. So we want growth. So there's this view that, well, if we want to get more of these scale-ups, they grow fast. They do this 20% for 3 consecutive years and everything's hunky-dory. But there's only a few of those firms. I did the first piece of analysis using that definition for Nestor back in 2009. They called it the vital 6%. That percentage proportion hasn't really changed. The Scale-Up Institute talks about 42,000, depending on definition by employment or turnover. But my argument is, and they want, well, we need 10,000 more, but they forget actually that, it's a bit like immigration figures. There's a net flow in and out of that particular total, so we need to be careful about that. But I think it's about, if they think it's an easy win, how do if we work with a firm that's already 10 employees, there's less firms to think about. That's obviously the first key point from an official. Then we say, well, we want to look at firms that have already shown signs of growth. Well, not many have. So you're narrowing down the population. But I would say to them, well, why start at 10? Let's look at 1 to 2. So they're missing out they're cutting off at the knees the potential to help those firms to grow. And it's not just about, public sector subvention subsidies. It is actually about creating an environment to acknowledge them, to celebrate them as much as we celebrate those firms that are launching onto the AIM market for the first time.
What is the answer then, Mark? Because we could be missing out on future big employers. We could be missing out by targeting, as you say, the wrong businesses in the first place. But what is the answer? Because if it's not down to just government, it's down to a mix of something, isn't it?
Well, it's not that we're missing out, because the proof of the pudding is that these firms survived a quarter of a century, and they weren't really focused on by government. So they're doing it. My argument is, well, how much more could we have gone? How many more of those micro enterprises could have survived the 10 years, who could have proven products and services, who could have been bought out, and all sorts of activity? We're missing because they're invisible, and people see them as invisible, not worth bothering about, because it's too difficult. It's a bit like during COVID when the recently self-employed were, well, we don't know who they are, we haven't seen their self-assessment returned. Oh, it's just too difficult, let's not bother with them. So here we have micro enterprises who are really struggling, perhaps to get traction in their markets. So to actually acknowledge them, and one of the things that I've been doing is making sure that we help to grow management essentials. We made 17 videos. A colleague of mine wrote the scripts for 17 videos.
Can I just hang on a minute? Can I just ask you, Mark, what you mean by that? Help to Grow Management's a government scheme that helps businesses. But what's the essentials bit?
The essentials bit was, and this goes back to the small business minister at the time, Hollenrake, who said, well, what are we doing for those firms who don't reach the 5 employee threshold to be eligible for the programme? So basically, I said, well, let's do something. So chartered ABS, contacted my colleague at Aston Business School, Paula Whitehouse. She wrote the scripts. We have 17 6-minute videos that we just gave away. We gave away to anybody. We pushed them out through the FSB, Chamber, etc., as a way of saying, look, we acknowledge you, which is great. We're not giving you any money, but we acknowledge you. And there's a program here when you start to get over the threshold you may want to think about. That's really useful. So that is an example of a government minister and of a department thinking, we must do more, and here's what we can do without breaking the bank. As we know, budgets are tight. So that's what I mean by acknowledging them, celebrating them, and giving them the some guidance on how they might think about growing their businesses. The point is, it's easier to identify and work with 40,000 firms than it is with 500,000 firms or 1 million firms who are small. So I can understand it from the policy perspective. And then we load on top of that the industrial strategy and the industrial strategy at sectors. And then we load on top of that, like the Oxford, Cambridge, London triangle. And then we think about, well, we can't ignore the regions. It all becomes sort of, let's focus on 500 firms or 1,000 firms in the West Midlands. And suddenly when the money gets distributed, then the easy win is let's go with firms that are visible, making contributions, perhaps exporting, perhaps doing innovative things with Innovate UK. And therefore, I understand why policy tends to ignore the micros. My argument is, let's do the numbers, let's look at the evidence, let's think through how we can aid these firms accelerate their growth, because clearly I've got 1,000 entrepreneurs, businesses that have really, bucked the trend, started off micro, creating 80 odd jobs, 10, 12 million turnover, as I've said, on average. And which means there's some bigger firms in there. Sorry to be sort of in the teaching mode there, but you get my point. That's the mean and median. So we need to think about very carefully what we can do. So I think it's about saying these firms exist everywhere. They are vital to society. They're vital to the economy. They're vital, contractors to some of the larger small businesses. They are in the interstices of the economy, and we ignore them at our peril. And they are scaling. So let's celebrate their scaling. And let's get hung up on a silly definition of a scale-up, which is doing no service at all to the whole growth agenda in the UK.
So one final question then, Mark. If they are so vital, so important, it's not just to the economy, though, is it? It's to the wider society. So I think we all should be exercised about this.
Absolutely, because a colleague of mine, Monda Ram at the Aston Business School, a good friend of the research centre, he talks about the everyday economy, and that's what these businesses represent. The everyday economy in sectors which are not that exciting for a minister to go and open. Coffee shops, for example. The independent coffee shops are, you can't walk up a high street. Well, sorry, I shouldn't mention high streets, because you probably can walk up a high street without seeing a coffee shop. But you get the point. We use them, and but a coffee shop. I remember an exporter of the year was a coffee house from Northern Ireland way back a few years ago. So just coffee beans and coffee as an exporter of the year. That's an example again of people turn their nose up at that. Oh no, we want something a bit more, something a bit more exciting than that. Something about fintech, biotech, life sciences, etc., etc. But the everyday economy is important. We have to support it. The whole small business strategy acknowledges that with the high street and the importance of that. That's where these micros mostly operate, on the high streets of our towns and cities and villages. It's really important that we find ways of supporting them. And it's hard. It's difficult to think of the right strategies, but certainly to acknowledge their important role is the first step. To make visible their contribution to the economy, to the local economy. And as you say, they create jobs. They are much more tuned into the needs of the locality in which they're surviving, the community. And if we look at a range of ethnic minority businesses are really an important sector to be thinking about. Ethnic minorities, I know from my global entrepreneurship monitor work, are more entrepreneurial than lifelong residents in the UK. They're important. They're part of our diverse culture. They're part of the economy. And ethnic minority business leaders are much more attuned into the needs of a community. Again, my colleague Monda Ram and his work around Birmingham with NatWest demonstrates that quite clearly. So we need to be careful that we just don't get carried away with, if only we had 1,000 more of these, then we can fix the economy. No, we want an inclusive agenda, inclusive for the micro enterprises, acknowledging their contribution, helping them make bigger contributions, celebrate their stories. And, they pop up from time to time, but I think that the micro enterprise lobby is finding a voice, but it needs to get stronger based on the evidence, and that's what the Enterprise Research Centre can put into the story. We can give you, I won't make any reference to armaments, but we can give you the evidence to actually help with the advocacy that you want to make for particular groups of micro enterprises in our economy and society.
We look forward to using your evidence to get that voice out there. Mark Hart, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.